The morning Wallace Bristol rode onto Maria Ramsey's land with a torch already burning in his gloved hand. The sky was the color of an old bruise, purple and yellow at the edges, and somewhere in the tall grass a meadowlark was singing like it didn't know the world was about to change. Maria had been awake since before dawn, the way she always was, because the homestead demanded early rising, and she had never once in her 26 years of life found rest to be something she could afford. She was at the well drawing the first bucket of water when she heard the horses, and she turned with the rope still in her hands and shielded her eyes against the rising sun and saw them coming. 3 riders. The one in the front was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and he was carrying a flame. She set the bucket down very carefully, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her, that in a moment of absolute terror she set the bucket down as though she intended to come back and finish drawing water in a few minutes. Then she walked to the porch and took the Winchester rifle from just inside the door and came back out to stand in the dry yard with the gun across her forearms. "That's far enough," she called. The 3 riders pulled their horses to a stop perhaps 40 yards out. The tall one with the torch looked at her for a long moment. He had a jaw like a shelf of limestone, dark stubble across it, and eyes that were a shade of gray-green she could see even from that distance, though she would not have been able to explain how. He looked like a man who had not slept well in some time. "Maria Ramsey," he called back. "Who's asking?" "Wallace Bristol. I ride for Harlan Creed." The name Harlan Creed landed in her chest like a stone dropped into a well. She had known it was coming. She had known for 3 months, since Harlan Creed had sent his first letter through the Laramie Land Office, offering to buy her 340 acres for a price that was an insult to the soil itself, to the years her father had broken his back over it, to the grave at the east fence line where her father lay buried beside the woman he had loved. She had sent the letter back without a written reply, which she suspected had communicated her feelings adequately. "Then you can ride back to Harlan Creed," she said, "and tell him the answer is still no." One of the men behind Wallace Bristol said something she couldn't hear. The other one laughed. Wallace Bristol did not laugh. He looked down at the torch in his hand as if he had only just noticed it was there, and something moved across his face that she couldn't read from 40 yards. "Creed's not asking any more," he said. "Neither am I," she said. She pulled the lever on the Winchester and let the sound of it carry across the dry morning air. There was a long silence. A horse stamped. The meadowlark was still singing, which seemed almost obscene under the circumstances. Then one of the men behind Wallace Bristol nudged his horse forward, and Wallace Bristol put his arm out sideways without even turning around, and the man's horse stopped. "Fetch, get back," Wallace said. The man named Fetch muttered something ugly but pulled his horse back. Wallace Bristol was still looking at Maria Ramsey. She was not a small woman in bearing, though she was not large in frame. She stood straight as a fence post, dark hair pulled back from a face that was sun-browned and clean-featured, and she held that rifle like it was an extension of her arms. She did not look afraid. That was the thing that stopped him, he would realize later when he had time to think about it. He had ridden onto a good many properties in the last 2 years, delivering Harlan Creed's particular brand of persuasion, and the people on those properties had almost always looked afraid. This woman looked like she had decided something and was waiting for him to understand it. He looked at the homestead behind her. It was not large. A main house built from good timber carefully dovetailed at the corners, the way a man builds when he intends to stay. A barn with a proper roof. A chicken coop. A kitchen garden along the south side of the house, and even from 40 yards he could see it was well tended, the rows straight, the plants healthy despite the dry summer. There was a windmill that creaked in the early morning air. There were flowers along the porch railing that had been planted in old coffee cans. He felt something tighten in his chest that he did not have a name for. "Creed wants this land by the end of the month," he said, and even as he said it he heard how hollow the words were. "Creed can want whatever he likes," Maria Ramsey said. This land belonged to my father, and it belongs to me now, and it will belong to whoever I leave it to, and Harlan Creed's name will never be on the deed. You can write that down if you need to remember it." He sat on his horse for another long moment. Then he extinguished the torch against the leather of his saddle skirt, grinding it out carefully, and the small column of smoke it made drifted sideways in the morning breeze. "Mount up," he said to the men behind him. Fetch said, "Creed ain't going to be happy." "I know it," Wallace said. They rode back the way they had come, and Maria Ramsey watched them go until they crested the low ridge to the north and disappeared. Then she sat down on the porch step because her legs had finally decided to remember that they were made of bone and muscle and not iron, and she pressed both hands flat against her knees and breathed until her heart slowed to something reasonable. She did not think she had seen the last of them. She was right. What she did not know, and could not have guessed, was that Wallace Bristol rode directly to the town of Caldwell Creek rather than back to Creed's ranch, and that he sat in the back of the Broken Spur saloon for 2 hours drinking whiskey he didn't want, and that the thing he kept seeing behind his eyes was not the rifle she had held so steadily, but the flowers in the coffee cans on the porch railing. He had been riding for Harlan Creed for 2 years. He had come west from Missouri after the war between the states had finished taking everything from him that it intended to take, and he had found work wherever he could find it. And Creed had found him in a cattle town outside of Wichita and offered him a wage that was better than what he was making and asked no questions about his past. For 2 years he had told himself that the things Creed asked him to do were not precisely illegal, that they were simply the business of a man who understood how land and money worked together, that the families who sold their homesteads under pressure from Creed's men were perhaps better off for it in the end, that the West was hard, and not everyone was suited to it. He was 29 years old, and he was very tired of lying to himself. He rode back to Creed's ranch that evening, and he found Creed on the porch of the main house, a large man going gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since become merely powerful. "Did it get done?" Creed asked. "No," Wallace said. Creed looked at him for a long moment. "I don't pay you to tell me no." "No, sir," Wallace agreed. "Then why are you standing here telling me no?" Wallace took his hat off and turned it in his hands. He had a habit of doing this when he was thinking, and he had been doing it since he was a boy in Missouri, and it had not served him any better over the years, but the habit remained. She had a rifle and the look of a woman who knew how to use it. Creed's expression did not change. "There are 3 of you." "Yes, sir." "Then the rifle does not present an insurmountable problem." Wallace put his hat back on. "I'm not burning a woman out, Creed." "I'll do a lot of things, but I won't do that." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Creed had a pair of men playing cards on the far end of the porch, and they had both stopped looking at their cards, and the only sound was the summer insects and the distant lowing of cattle. "You have 2 days to change your thinking," Creed said, very quietly, "or you and I are going to have a different kind of conversation." Wallace went to the bunkhouse and lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling and thought about flowers in coffee cans, and a woman who set down a water bucket like she intended to come back to it. The following morning he was gone before anyone else on the Creed ranch was awake. He had $2.30 in his pocket, a good horse, a bedroll, and a rifle. He also had a conscience that had been quiet for 2 years and had apparently decided that enough was enough. He rode south, away from the Creed ranch, intending to ride as far south as the next town, and then figure out where a man went when he had decided to stop being the person he had been. He had been riding for perhaps an hour, the sun still low and pale over the eastern plains, when the road curved, and he found himself looking at the Ramsey homestead from the south side, and he could see the kitchen garden and the windmill and the barn. And there was a woman in the garden with a hoe moving between the rows with the particular economy of motion that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done and having very little time to waste on doing it. He pulled his horse to a stop and sat there for a long moment. Then he turned the horse up the road toward the gate. Maria heard the horse before she saw it. She straightened from the garden and had her hand on the hoe handle like it was a weapon before she recognized the man, and even recognizing him did not make her hand relax much. Wallace Bristol pulled his horse up at the gate and did not open it or make any move toward it. He took his hat off, which was, she supposed, something. "I'm not here for Creed," he said. "You're not working for him anymore. I left this morning." She looked at him carefully. He was sitting very still on the horse, hat in his hands, and he looked like a man who had not arrived at this moment without some cost to himself. There were shadows under his gray-green eyes and something in his expression that was both resolute and uncertain in a way that she found, against her better judgment, to be credible. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I've done a lot of things in the last 2 years that I'm not proud of. Yesterday I rode onto your land with a torch and I told myself I was just doing a job, and then I looked at your house and I thought about your father building it and I couldn't do it. I'm not asking you to think well of me. I just wanted you to know that I'm done with Creed." She leaned on her hoe and regarded him. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I don't entirely know yet." "Do you know anything about farming?" He blinked. This was not apparently the direction he had expected the conversation to go. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. Do you know how to put a roof on a barn?" "I do. My barn roof has 3 places where it leaks when it rains. I have 60 acres of wheat that needs harvesting before the end of September, and I have a broken fence on the east pasture and a well casing that needs relining." She tilted her head. "I can't pay much. I can pay room and board and $1 a week until the harvest comes in, and then I can do better." He stared at her. "You're offering me work." "I'm offering you work," she agreed. "You can sleep in the barn. There's a spare room in the house, but that wouldn't be appropriate, and besides, the barn's in better shape than it looks from the outside. My father built it well." He sat on his horse for a moment longer. Then he dismounted and looped the reins over the gate post and said, "All right." "All right," she said. She went back to hoeing her garden, and he stood at the gate for a moment looking at the property with a new kind of attention. The attention of a man who is measuring not what needs to be destroyed, but what needs to be done. And then he went to the barn to put up his horse and start taking stock of the roof situation. His name was Wallace Bristol, and 3 days ago he had ridden onto her land with a torch. Now he was on his knees in her barn with a bucket collecting the rain leaks he could find in the dry wood, pressing his hand against the boards and feeling where the light came through. It did not make sense, and it made perfect sense, the way most things in the West did in 1878, which was the year this story takes place, the year after the terrible winter that had killed so much cattle and broken so many homesteaders, the year that Harlan Creed was buying up everything he could get his hands on because the broken homesteaders were selling cheap. Maria had not sold cheap. Maria had not sold at all. She brought him supper that first night, a plate of beans and cornbread and a cup of coffee, and she set it on the old crate that served as a table near the barn door and said, "Don't get ideas," which was perhaps not the most gracious thing she had ever said, but which she felt was necessary. He looked up from the shingle he was examining. "I don't have any ideas," he said. "I'm just a man eating beans." "Good," she said. She went back to the house and stood at the kitchen window for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, looking at the lantern light in the barn. She had not been entirely alone on the homestead since her father had died in the spring, 7 months ago, and she had not realized until just now how much the presence of another person changed the quality of the dark. Over the following days, they settled into a rhythm that was almost entirely practical, and which did not give either of them much room to think about anything other than the work. Wallace was up before dawn and working by the time the sun cleared the eastern hills, and Maria was never far behind him, and between them they were doing what 3 people should have been doing, which meant they were both tired by nightfall and did not have much energy for conversation. But conversation happened anyway, in the small gaps between tasks, the way it does when 2 people are working closely toward the same purpose. She learned that he had grown up on a farm outside of Jefferson City, Missouri, the the fourth of 5 children, and that his father had been a decent man who grew corn and kept dairy cattle and read the Bible every Sunday morning. She learned that he had fought in the war, that he had been 16 when it started and 19 when it ended, which meant he had seen things that no boy of 16 should see, though he did not describe them in detail, and she did not ask him to. He learned that she had come west with her father when she was 12, in 1864, trailing up from Texas because her father had a dream of wheat farming on the plains, and nothing had managed to kill that dream, not the hardship of the trail, not the years of drought in the early 70s, not the fact that he was a Mexican man trying to hold land in a territory where Mexican land claims were treated with varying degrees of respect, depending entirely on who needed your land at any given moment. Her father's name had been Rodrigo Ramsey, and the Ramsey came from her mother, who had been a woman from Virginia named Elizabeth Ramsey, and she had died when Maria was 9, and her father had never stopped missing her. Were there troubles? Wallace asked one evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper because the night was cooler than the days had been and the air smelled of the sage that grew thick along the south fence. With the land, she said. With people. About your father being Mexican. She was quiet for a moment. The frogs were singing in the creek below the east pasture, and the stars were coming out one by one overhead the way they did out here, individually, each one making itself known before the great mass of them arrived. Yes, she said. There were troubles. The land office tried twice to say his claim was invalid. He had his papers in order both times and he made them acknowledge it, which was not easy and cost us money we didn't have for a lawyer in Wichita. The man at the Caldwell Creek General Store wouldn't let him have credit even after we had a harvest to show. She paused. People can be very creative about the ways they find to make you feel unwelcome. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him sideways. Why are you sorry? Did you do any of those things? No, he said. Then you don't have to be sorry, you just have to be decent. He thought about that for a moment. I rode onto your land with a torch, he said quietly. You did, she agreed. That's not decent. No, she said, it wasn't. There was a long silence and then she said, but you put it out. He didn't say anything. I noticed that, she said. Before you left, you put it out. She went inside shortly after, and he sat on the porch for another half-hour watching the stars come fully out, and he thought about the fact that she had noticed. He thought about what it meant that it mattered to him that she had noticed. The weeks passed. September came on with its particular urgency, and the wheat was golden and ready, and Wallace had repaired the barn roof and relined the well casing and fixed the east fence and done a dozen other things that she had not even asked of him, things he had noticed needed doing and simply done, the way a person does when they have started to think of a place as something worth caring for. The harvest was hard work, and they could not do it alone. Maria had arranged with 2 neighboring families, the Prater family to the west and the Dunmore family to the south, to share labor for the harvest, which was the old way of doing things on the plains and which worked because it had to work. On the day the Prater family arrived, Jim Prater looked at Wallace Bristol with the careful eyes of a man assessing a stranger, and Wallace shook his hand and said nothing that needed to be explained, and Jim Prater said nothing that required explanation either, and they went to work. Clara Prater, who was Jim's wife and a forthright woman of 40 with sun-bleached hair and the kind of directness that comes from having seen most things life has to offer, caught Maria alone at the well in the late afternoon and said, "Who is that man?" "He works for me," Maria said. "I can see that. I mean, who is he?" Maria pumped the handle and watched the water come out cold and silver. "His name is Wallace Bristol. He came here from Missouri. He's not from around here." "No." Clara Prater handed her a bucket to fill. "He works like a man who's trying to make up for something." Maria set the bucket under the spout and pumped steadily. "A lot of people in the West are trying to make up for something." Clara smiled at her, and it was a smile that contained approximately 30 years of wisdom about men and women and the ways they circled each other before deciding anything. "Yes," she said, "they surely are." The harvest took 4 days, and by the end of it the wheat was in, and the barn was full of a gold-smelling plenty that made Maria stand in the barn door in the evening light and feel, for the first time since her father had died, that the land was going to be all right. She put her hand against the barn doorframe and closed her eyes and said something quiet in Spanish that Wallace, passing behind her with a pair of empty grain sacks, did not understand but understood anyway, because it was the sound of a person arriving at the end of a very long road and finding that the road had been worth walking. He slowed without stopping, not wanting to intrude, and went on to the storage room. But he held that image for a long time afterward, the way she stood in the wide golden light with her eyes closed, and the feeling it gave him was one he had not felt in a very long time, which was the feeling of having arrived somewhere. What he had not told her, and what he had been thinking about for 3 weeks, was that Harlan Creed was not the kind of man who accepted the word no as a final answer. He had not brought this up because he did not want to frighten her, and because he had not been certain of his own position long enough to feel that he had the right to talk about it. But the harvest was in now, and the season was turning, and he had begun to hear things in town that made him think the situation was becoming urgent. He went to Caldwell Creek on a Wednesday in late September for supplies, and he heard from 2 separate people that Creed had hired additional men, and that there had been trouble at the Henderson homestead 7 miles north, where a fire of uncertain origin had destroyed a hay storage barn, and that the Hendersons had sold their land to Creed within the week. He rode back to the Ramsey homestead with the supplies, and with a tightness in his chest that he could not talk himself out of. He found Maria in the kitchen garden, cutting the last of the late tomatoes, and he unhitched the wagon and came to find her and said, "I need to talk to you about Creed." She straightened and looked at him. She had a tomato in each hand, round and red as anything, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that were very direct and very clear, and she said, "Tell me." He told her everything he knew. He told her about the Henderson fire and about the additional men he had heard Creed was hiring, and about the fact that the end of the harvest season was when Creed tended to move on properties because the homesteaders were tired from the work and sometimes less alert. He told her that he believed Creed would move against her property before winter. She listened to all of it without interrupting him, and when he was done, she set the tomatoes in her basket and stood with her arms crossed over her apron and said, "So what do we do?" He had thought about this on the ride back. "You need to go to the sheriff in Caldwell Creek and put your concerns on record officially. You need witnesses who will say they saw Creed's men on your property. And you need to make sure Creed understands that burning you out will not go unobserved." "The sheriff in Caldwell Creek is a man named Bates," she said, "and his office is in a building that Creed owns." This was information he had not had. He thought about it. "The county seat is in Harrington." "Yes." "That's 30 miles east." "Yes." "Then you go to Harrington," he said. "You go to the county sheriff and you file a formal complaint. You put Creed's name on paper. A man like Creed, the thing he is most afraid of is paper. He can burn a barn, but he can't burn a record at the county office." She looked at him for a long moment. The light was going golden orange in the west, the way it did in late September, and it lit up the side of her face and made her look very serious and very beautiful, and he was struck by it in a way that he had been struck by her several times now and which he continued to handle poorly, which is to say he cleared his throat and looked away. "When should we go?" She said. "Soon," he said, "before the weather turns." They went to Harrington 2 days later, Maria in the wagon and Wallace riding alongside. It was a full day's journey, and they made camp overnight in the shelter of a dry creek bed, with a fire that was small and practical, and a supper of biscuits and cold ham that Maria had packed in the same efficient way she did everything. They slept at proper distance from each other under separate blankets, and above the fire the stars were immense and close, the way they only are on the open plains. "Do you ever think about going back to Missouri?" she asked, and her voice was quiet in the dark. He thought about it honestly before answering. "No," he said, "there's nothing in Missouri anymore that I need to get back to." "What about family? My parents are gone. My brothers scattered after the war. My sister married a man in Kansas City and she's fine without me." He paused. "I was the one who didn't land anywhere after it ended. Some people come home and find their lives waiting for them. Some people find that their lives don't fit anymore." She was quiet for a moment. "I understand that," she said. "After my father died, I kept looking around the house for someone to tell things to, and then I remembered." "I'm sorry about your father," he said. "He was a good man," she said. "He deserved better than what the world gave him. He deserved to have his land honored and his work honored and his name said with respect." Her voice was even, but he could hear the edge of something in it that was not quite grief, but was the thing grief becomes after it has lived with you long enough. "That's why I won't sell. It's not about me, it's about him." He lay there looking at the stars and feeling the weight of that. "Rodrigo Ramsey," he said softly. "Yes," she said. "Then we'll make sure his land stays his land," he said. There was a silence, and then she said, "Wallace." "Yes, thank you." He did not sleep for a long time after that. The county sheriff in Harrington was a man named Garrett Hale, and he was the kind of man the West occasionally produced, which is to say he was competent, honest, and completely unsentimental about it. He listened to Maria's account of the intimidation by Creed's men, and he looked at the deed she had brought, and he looked at the statement she had written out in a careful hand laying out the dates and the specifics, and he said, "Harlan Creed's been a problem in this county for 4 years. We haven't had anything solid enough to act on." "You have it now," Maria said. Sheriff Hale looked at Wallace. "You rode for Creed." "For 2 years," Wallace said. "I can give you a statement." Hale's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing. "Why would you do that?" "Because I did things I shouldn't have done while I was riding for him," Wallace said. "And because what he's doing to this woman and her land is wrong." Hale drummed his fingers on his desk for a moment. Then he reached for paper and pen. "All right," he said. "Talk." They spent 3 hours in Hale's office, and when they came out, the late afternoon sun was orange over the town, and Maria had official statements filed, and Hale had committed to sending a deputy out to the Caldwell Creek area on a regular basis for the next several weeks, and Creed's name was on record in the county office attached to a formal complaint. On the wagon ride back to the homestead with the stars coming out over the vast dark plain, Maria said, "You didn't have to do that. Give a statement. That's going to make Creed angry at you personally." "He was already going to be angry at me personally," Wallace said. "You could have left. When I hired you, you could have taken the wage for a few weeks and moved on. Nobody would have blamed you." He was driving the wagon and he kept his eyes on the road ahead of him. "I didn't want to move on," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" He thought about how to say the next thing honestly and simply, because he had spent 2 years saying things that were neither honest nor simple, and he had no appetite left for anything else. "Because this is the first place in a long time that has felt worth staying for," he said. And then, because that was not entirely complete, he added, "And because you're the most remarkable person I've met in a long time, and I'd like to keep knowing you if you'll allow it." She did not say anything immediately, and the horses moved steadily through the dark, and the wagon wheels ground softly on the road, and the night air was cold enough now that she had pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Then she said, "I'll allow it." And something in those 2 words, said so quietly and so plainly, was more than he had hoped for. They were back at the homestead by midnight, and the next day they went back to work, but the quality of things between them had shifted in the way that things shift when 2 people have said something true to each other, and neither of them has run from it. He noticed small things more keenly now. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair back behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way she laughed, which was not a common occurrence but which, when it happened, was completely unguarded and entirely genuine. The way she talked to the garden in the mornings, not exactly to the plants but to the air around them, in the mixed Spanish and English that was her native register, and that she seemed to drop into without thinking when she was relaxed. She noticed things too, though she was not yet prepared to fully examine what she was doing with the information. She noticed that he had a habit of pausing before he said something important, as if he were checking the weight of the words. She noticed that he was patient with the animals in a way that was not performed patience, but actual ease. She noticed that he had started putting small repairs on things she hadn't even asked about, had replaced 3 loose boards on the porch steps without saying anything, had oiled all the door hinges so that none of them squeaked anymore, had planted a second row of rosemary along the south garden fence because she'd mentioned once in passing that rosemary was her father's favorite. That last thing she noticed one morning, and she stood looking at it for a moment and felt something move in her chest that was warm and inconvenient and did not go away when she tried to be practical about it. October arrived, and with it the first cold mornings. Frost came one night, and by morning the last of the garden was done, and Maria walked the rows pulling the cold dead plants, and Wallace worked beside her, and they worked in companionable silence for a while before she said, "I've been thinking about next spring." "What about it?" he said. "I want to put in more wheat. I have the east field that I've left fallow this year. If I can get seed from the Praters before winter, I can expand the yield by a third." He straightened and looked at the east field, which was wide and well-drained and had good soil, the dark loamy kind that the plains produced in the river-fed low spots. "You'd need help," he said. "I know it." He looked at her, and she was looking at the east field, not at him, and her expression was the one she got when she was thinking about the land, which was very intent and very clear. "I'd like to help," he said. "If there's still work here in the spring." She looked at him then directly. The question in her eyes was not about work. "There is," she said. "There will be." They stood there for a moment in the October morning, the pulled plants at their feet and the cold sky overhead and the land all around them in every direction, and they were very close together without having moved any closer, which is the most peculiar kind of proximity. Then a sound from the north road made them both turn. 4 riders coming fast. Wallace said, "Get to the house," and his voice had a new quality in it, flat and certain. "This is my land," Maria said, and she was already walking toward the house, but she meant it in a different way than he had meant the house. She meant toward the rifle. The 4 riders were Creed's men. He recognized 2 of them, Fetch and a man named Dunbar, and the other 2 were new, the men he had heard about, hired muscle. They pulled up at the gate, and Fetch, who was a man with a grudge and a mean disposition, leaned over his saddle horn and smiled. "Looking good, Bristol," Fetch said. "Turned yourself into a farmer." "What do you want?" Wallace said. "Creed wants a conversation with the lady," Fetch said. Maria had come out of the house with the Winchester. "Creed can come and have a conversation in person," she said. "These 4 can ride back." "Creed sent a message," Fetch said, and he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper and held it out. "Leave it at the gate," Wallace said. Fetch dropped the paper over the gate post, and it fell into the dust of the road. Maria did not go to pick it up, and Wallace did not either, and after a moment Fetch said, "You know how this ends, Bristol. You and Creed, that's a debt that comes due." "I know about debts," Wallace said. The 4 riders turned and went back up the north road, and this time there was no torch, which was not reassuring, because a man like Creed who came without a torch was a man who had found a different approach. Wallace retrieved the letter and brought it to the porch. They read it together. It was written in a lawyer's hand, which meant Creed had hired a lawyer, and it alleged that the deed to the Ramsey property was invalid on the grounds of an administrative irregularity in the original land office filing in 1868, and it gave notice that Creed's interests, represented by the law office of Whitmore and Dill in Wichita, would be pursuing legal remedy. Maria read it twice. Her face was very still. "It's not valid," she said. "My father's deed is valid. He had it verified twice." "I know it," Wallace said, "but a lawyer in Wichita can make things complicated for a long time even if they're not valid. That's the point. He's going to try to bury you in legal costs and delays." She set the letter down on the porch railing and looked out at the land, and he saw her jaw set in the way it did when she had decided something. Then we fight it, she said. You'll need a lawyer. I know, she was quiet for a moment. I have the harvest money. He looked at her. The harvest money was going to get you through the winter and buy seed for spring. I know that too, she said. He said, I have some money saved, not much but some. I was saving it for he paused. I was saving it is all. You can have it. She turned to look at him directly. I'm not taking your money, Wallace. It's not a gift, he said. It's an investment. If this land goes to Creed, I don't have a job or a place to be, so it's in my interest for the land to stay yours. She looked at him for a long moment with those clear dark eyes that could see through most things and several things in particular, and she said, That is possibly the least romantic reason for helping someone that I have ever heard. He blinked. I wasn't trying to be romantic. I know, she said. That's why it works. She took his money and added it to the harvest money and wrote a letter to a lawyer in Harrington named Ezra Vaughn, who had a good reputation with land disputes and who had, she had heard from Clara Prater, once made a junior partner at Whitmore and Dill cry in open court, which seemed like a useful quality. Ezra Vaughn came out to the homestead the following week, a small, precise man with spectacles and an excellent memory, and he sat at the kitchen table with Maria's deed and all her father's original papers spread before him, and went through them with the thoroughness of a man who understood that documents were a kind of architecture, and that every document either held weight or it didn't. The deed is sound, he said after 2 hours. Your father's original filing in 1868 was executed correctly. The alleged administrative irregularity that Creed's lawyers are citing is a provision that was in effect for less than 1 year and was superseded by the Homestead Amendment of 1869, and any competent judge will see that immediately. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them on his vest. Creed's lawyers are not incompetent. They know this won't hold. What they're doing is creating delay and expense in the hope that you run out of resources before they do. I understand that, Maria said. Do you have the resources to sustain a 6-month legal process? She looked at Wallace. Wallace looked at her. There was a conversation in that look that was wordless and complete. We'll find them, Maria said. Vaughn put his spectacles back on and made a note. Very well. I'll file our response in the county court by the end of the month. I have to be honest with you, Miss Ramsey. Creed is a wealthy man and he has connections in this territory. I can win this on the law, but it may be an uncomfortable process. Most worthwhile things are, Maria said. Vaughn smiled very slightly. Yes, he said. They generally are. After he left, Maria and Wallace sat at the kitchen table with the papers between them and the October afternoon light coming through the window, and the house was quiet except for the tick of the clock her father had carried from Texas, a small brass clock that sat on the mantelpiece and kept time with a steadiness that Wallace had come to find quietly reassuring. I want to tell you something, she said. All right, he said. When you first rode up to this gate 2 months ago, I thought you were like every other man Creed sends, big and hard and willing to do whatever you're told for money. She paused. I was angry. I was so angry that day, not just at you, at all of it. At Creed and at the lawyers who tried to take my father's land and at the men in this territory who think a woman alone on a homestead is an invitation. You hit it well, he said. You looked like you were waiting to shoot me. I was, she said. I was absolutely planning to shoot you if you came through that gate. He thought about that. What changed your mind? You put out the torch, she said. When you turned to leave, you ground out the torch against your saddle. You didn't have to do that. Nobody was watching. It was just you making a choice. He looked at his hands on the table, which were rougher now from 2 months of honest work than they had been when he arrived. It wasn't much of a choice, he said. It was everything, she said. That's what I wanted to tell you. It was everything. They sat there for a moment in the quiet kitchen with the clock ticking and the afternoon light on the table between them, and then, very slowly and with a kind of careful deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of both of them, she put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it. Neither of them said anything else, and the clock kept ticking, and outside the window the cottonwood tree that her father had planted along the south fence had gone entirely yellow, and the leaves were falling in the still air one by one, each of them catching the light before it went. The legal fight lasted for months. Ezra Vaughn was as good as his reputation, and the response he filed was thorough and airtight, and included a detailed historical record of the Ramsey deed and its validation. And Creed's lawyers came back with another approach, and Vaughn dispatched that too. And in January of 1879, on a day when the plains were white and still under 6 inches of snow, the judge in Harrington ruled that the Ramsey deed was valid and that the claim by Creed's interests was without legal merit. Maria got the letter on a Tuesday. She read it at the kitchen table with Wallace standing by the stove where he had been warming his hands, and when she finished reading, she folded the letter very precisely along its original creases and set it on the table and put both hands flat on the table on either side of it and breathed. "We won," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, and he could see that she was holding something very tightly, the way people hold things when they are not sure what will happen if they let them go. He crossed the kitchen in about 4 steps, and she stood up and he put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his chest, and she did not cry because she was not a person who cried easily, but she held on to him with both hands gripping the back of his coat as if the ground were moving under her feet. He held her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and outside the snow was falling again in small dry flakes that whispered against the windows. After a moment she said into his chest, "My father would have been so angry that it came to this." "Yes," Wallace said, "and then he would have made coffee and gone back to work." "Sounds like the right approach," Wallace said. She pulled back enough to look up at him, and she was smiling, which was not the same smile she gave when something was merely pleasant, but the deeper, rarer one that he had seen perhaps 4 times in 4 months, and which did things to him that he was no longer pretending to be neutral about. "I'm going to make coffee," she said. "I'll get more wood," he said. They separated and went to their separate tasks, and neither of them acknowledged what had just passed between them, which was not denial but rather something more like reverence, the way you don't reach immediately for the most important things because you want to be sure of your hands first. In the weeks that followed the legal victory, something changed in the way they moved around the homestead. It was subtle, and it was not subtle. They were closer in the ordinary sense, standing nearer to each other when they talked, sitting closer at the kitchen table in the evenings when she was reading, and he was doing whatever small repair or task he'd brought in out of the cold. But it was more than proximity. It was a kind of ease that neither of them had felt in a long time, the ease of being known by someone without having had to explain yourself fully, the ease that comes from having been through something hard together and come out the other side still standing. One evening in February, with the wind running strong from the north and the house creaking pleasantly against it, she was reading from a book her father had left, a worn copy of a collection of poetry that had traveled from Texas to Kansas in a wagon, and she read a passage aloud without planning to, just because it struck her, and she read it in Spanish first, the way her father had, and then translated it loosely into English. Wallace said, "What book is that?" "It was my father's," she said. He loved poetry. He said it was the only form of language honest enough to be worth the paper. She paused. "He taught me to read in Spanish first and English second, and he said both were necessary for different things." "What does Spanish do better?" Wallace asked. She considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "Feeling," she said. "There are feelings in Spanish that have no English word. The closest thing I know is the word for the light in the late afternoon, the way it slants, low and golden. There is no English word for that specific feeling. There is in Spanish." He was quiet for a moment. "Say it," he said. She looked at him. "The word," he said. "I'd like to hear it." She said it, and he repeated it badly, and she corrected his pronunciation, and he tried again, and this time it was better, and she laughed genuinely, the unguarded one, and he grinned, which was a thing he did so rarely and so well that it transformed his face entirely. And for a moment they were just two people in a warm house on a cold night, and the world outside was very large and very cold, and they were inside it together. He proposed to her in March, on a morning when the snow was melting for the first time, and the first thin green was coming up in the kitchen garden, the kind of early green that is almost more of an idea than a color. He had been thinking about it for weeks, not working up to it but working out the right way to say it, because he had learned by now that she was a woman who cared about the quality of language and about honesty, and he wanted to be honest. He found her at the fence line of the east field, looking out at the soil she intended to plant in spring wheat. She was wearing her canvas work coat, and she had mud on her boots already, and the wind was doing things to her hair that she had given up attempting to address, and she was entirely herself, which was the thing he loved most about her. He stopped beside her at the fence, and they both looked at the field for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to ask you something." "All right," she said. "I know I came here in a terrible way," he said. "I know I was a man doing bad things for worse reasons, and you had every right to shoot me at the gate. I know I've been trying for 7 months to be a different version of myself, and I don't know entirely whether I've managed it. I know you are the strongest person I have ever met and the most honest and the most worth knowing. And I know that this land is yours and your father's and always will be, and I wouldn't want it to be any other way." He paused and reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small band of silver that he had had made by the silversmith in Caldwell Creek, a simple and plain thing because she was a person who valued plain and simple things. "I would very much like to be here for the rest of my life," he said, "and I would like to be here as your husband if you'll have me." She looked at him. He looked back at her. The field was very quiet around them, just the drip of melting snow and the distant sound of the creek running fast with snowmelt. "You are going to help me plant 60 acres of spring wheat," she said. "Yes," he said. "And you are going to put a new roof on the chicken coop because it leaks even worse than the barn did." "Yes," he said. "And you are going to stay," she said, and it was not entirely a question, but it was not entirely not a question. "I am going to stay," he said. "I am going to stay every day that you'll have me." She took the ring from his hand and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him. And the thing in her eyes was not the practical assessment she gave most things, but something altogether different. Something that had been building since the morning she watched him grind out a torch and ride away. Something that had been confirmed by Rosemary in the south fence, and honest money offered plainly and arms that held her without requiring anything in return. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it on her hand against the muddy fence rail, and then she looked at him. And he leaned forward and kissed her for the first time, very carefully, as if the moment were made of something fragile, though it turned out not to be fragile at all. It turned out to be quite solid and warm, and to last considerably longer than either of them had planned. And when they separated, they were both smiling, and the east field lay before them in the March morning, full of the possibility of wheat. They were married in May, in the yard of the Homestead, in a ceremony conducted by the traveling minister who came through Caldwell Creek twice a year. Clara Prater cried and said she was not crying. Jim Prater shook Wallace's hand for a long time without saying much but meaning a great deal by it. The Dunmore family came with their children, and their eldest daughter, who was 12 and deeply romantic, scattered wildflowers from the kitchen garden along the path between the gate and the porch. Ezra Vaughn came from Harrington, because Maria had written to invite him and he had come, and he sat in the back row and looked quietly pleased. Maria wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had kept wrapped in paper in the cedar chest her father had brought from Texas, and which fit her as if her mother had known. It was ivory lawn cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar, and she wore it with her dark hair down, which was the only time she ever wore it down, and Wallace looked at her coming through the gate with the wildflowers at her feet and felt something in him go entirely still, the way a high wind goes still when the pressure changes, a stillness that was not absence but completion. He had cleaned up considerably for the occasion. New shirt, hair combed, boots blacked, the gray-green eyes clear and unguarded in a way they had not been when he rode onto this land with a torch. The minister said the words, and they said the words back, and he put a wider silver band on her finger alongside the first one, and she put a plain silver band on his, and the minister said what words the minister said. And when he was done, Wallace kissed her, and the Dunmore children cheered, and Clara Prater continued not to cry. That evening they sat on the porch, just the two of them now, the guests long gone and the yard quiet in the last of the May evening. And the cottonwood tree was fully green again, and the kitchen garden was lush, and the windmill was turning slowly in the late breeze, and the land went out in every direction, wide and real and entirely theirs. She had her head on his shoulder and his arm was around her, and they were both quiet in the good way that is not silence but rest. "I want to put up a new fence along the north property line this summer," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about posts." "Cedar," she said. "Nothing else lasts." "Cedar," he agreed. "And I want to write to the land office in Harrington about registering the deed in both our names." "I've already written the letter," he said. "I was going to tell you." She tilted her head to look up at him. "Were you?" "I finished it this morning," he said. "I wanted it to be ready." She settled back against his shoulder. Outside, somewhere in the tall grass along the south fence, a cricket had started up, and then another, and by the time the stars were fully out there was a whole chorus of them, the summer sound of the plains at night, which is not silence at all but a kind of fullness. "He would have liked you," she said. "Your father?" "Yes, not at first. At first he would have been suspicious, because a man who turns up doing the right thing after doing the wrong thing requires some watching, but he would have liked you in the end." "I hope so," Wallace said. "He would have appreciated the rosemary," she said. Wallace smiled into her hair. "I thought about him when I planted it. I thought this is the kind of thing a man does for a place he intends to stay." She put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. The silver rings were side by side now, and in the starlight they caught a faint gleam. "We're going to need to build another room," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he understood what she was saying, and the stillness came back, the complete kind. "Maria," he said. "I'm not certain yet," she said, "but I think so." He held her closer, and she let him, and they stayed there on the porch while the stars wheeled overhead, and the cricket chorus rose and fell, and the windmill turned, and the land lay quietly in every direction, 340 acres of wheat and possibility, belonging entirely to Rodrigo Ramsey's daughter, and the man who had come to burn it and stayed to build it back. Summer came on fully, and with it the confirmation of what Maria had suspected in May. She told Wallace on a morning when they were both at the well, and he set down the bucket he was holding with the same kind of careful deliberateness she had shown on the first morning she had ever seen him, and then he picked it back up, and then he set it down again, and she laughed at him. "You're going to drop that," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't know what to do with my hands." "That's unusual for you," she said. "You always know what to do with your hands." He reached out and took both of hers instead, and held them, and looked at her with the gray-green eyes that she had learned to read as well as any language, and said, "Are you all right? Are you feeling well?" "Feeling very well," she said. "I'm feeling better than I have in a long time." He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed them there for a moment, his eyes closing briefly, and she felt the warmth of it travel all the way up her arms. "We're going to need that room," he said. "I told you that in May," she said. "I know. I've been thinking about the east wall. If we add on to the east wall, we get morning light in the room, which is the best light." She looked at him with a fondness so complete it almost hurt. "You've been thinking about the east wall since May," she said. "I've been thinking about a lot of things since May," he said. He started on the room in August, when the wheat was golden and nearly ready for harvest, and the days were long and warm, and the light was the particular abundance of late summer on the plains. He worked on it in the evenings after the main work of the homestead was done, measuring and cutting timber from the good stand of cottonwood along the creek that they had agreed could spare some trees, dovetailing the corners the way her father had done. the way a man builds when he intends for something to last. She would bring him water and sit on the unfinished wall to watch him work, and they would talk while he worked the way they talked about everything, practically and honestly, about the harvest and the seed supply and the price of wheat in Caldwell Creek and the letter they had gotten from Ezra Vaughn confirming that the deed was now registered in both their names, and about the room and what they would put in it. "A good crib," she said. "My father made mine from ash wood. I don't know what happened to it." "I'll make one," he said. "I'm good with wood." "I know you are," she said. "I'll make it from cedar. Cedar smells clean and it keeps away insects." She looked at him with her head tilted slightly. "You've been reading about this." He did not deny it. "I went to the general store and talked to Mrs. Holt about it, and she lent me a pamphlet." She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "Mrs. Holt gave you a pamphlet on baby furniture." "She was very helpful," he said, in a tone that suggested Mrs. Holt had also been extremely amused. "She also said to tell you that she has some good soft flannel that came in on the last freight and that you should come in before it sells." She did smile then, fully, and got off the wall. "Come down for supper," she said. "It'll be getting dark soon." "5 more minutes," he said. "You always say 5 more minutes. And then I always come in," he said. "So it works out." She went inside and he heard her moving in the kitchen, heard the sound of the fire being built up and the clatter of the stove lid and the particular domestic music of the house that he had come to love in the way he loved all the things about this life that were ordinary and reliable and entirely sufficient. The harvest in the fall of 1879 was the best the Ramsey land had ever produced. The east field that Maria had planted in spring wheat came in full and heavy, and with Wallace working alongside her and the Prater and Dunmore families for the shared harvest, they brought it all in before the first frost. And when they stood in the barn looking at what they had done, Maria had her hand on her round belly and Wallace had his arm around her shoulders, and Jim Prater said, "You've got the best stand of wheat in Caldwell County this year, Maria. Your father would say the same." "Thank you, Jim," she said. Clara Prater hugged her and whispered something in her ear that made Maria laugh and Wallace look between them with gentle suspicion, and Clara said, "I'm just telling her what I told Jim before ours was born, which is that nobody ever feels ready and then it happens and you are." Wallace said, "That's reassuring." "I'm glad you find it so," Clara said, and patted his arm. The new room was finished in October, plastered and clean, with morning light coming through the east window exactly as Wallace had planned, and the cedar crib he had made stood in the corner with a small horse carved into the headboard, which he had added without telling her and which she discovered one evening and traced with her finger for a long moment without saying anything. "It's not fancy," he said from the doorway. "It's wonderful," she said. "I was thinking," he said, "if it's a boy, I thought we might call him Rodrigo, if you'd like." She turned from the crib to look at him. The lamp was behind him and she could not entirely read his face, but she didn't need to, because she knew him by now in the deep way, the way you know someone when you have worked beside them and slept near them and argued and agreed and watched the same stars and worried about the same weather and held the same land in your hands. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He crossed the room and put his arms around her from behind, and she put her hands over his where they rested on her, and they stood in the small cedar-smelling room with the clean plaster walls, and the horse on the crib's headboard and the east window dark, but already full of the promise of morning. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I have spent a long time in my life going in the wrong direction," he said. "Even when I was trying to go right, I wasn't because I didn't know what right looked like. I didn't know what a life was supposed to feel like when it was the right one." He paused. "This is what it feels like. I just wanted you to know that I know." She turned in his arms to face him. In the lamplight his face was open in a way it had not been when he rode onto her land with a torch, open and certain and entirely present, the face of a man who has arrived somewhere and recognized it. "I know too," she said. He kissed her, and outside the October wind moved through the cottonwood tree, which had gone yellow and was letting its leaves go one by one, each of them catching the light from the kitchen window as they fell, and the windmill was turning in the wind, and the North Star was steady over the plains, and the land was quiet and full and entirely itself. Rodrigo Wallace Bristol was born on a cold, clear morning in December 1879, when the snow was deep on the plains, and the house was warm and the cedar crib was waiting. He arrived with a considerable amount of expressed opinion about the experience, and he was dark-haired like his mother, and had his father's gray-green eyes, and Wallace held him in the first minutes with a careful steadiness that was entirely characteristic, and looked down at this small, loud person, and felt something in him go so completely open that he understood for the first time why people said they would do anything for their children, because he already knew he would. Maria watched him from the bed, tired and clear-eyed and entirely herself. "He's angry about something," she said. "I think he just prefers to make his feelings known," Wallace said. "He gets that from you," she said. "I don't make my feelings known," he said. "You planted rosemary along my south fence because my father liked it," she said. "You wrote a letter to the land office before I thought to ask you to. You made a cedar crib with a horse on the headboard." He looked at her. "You make your feelings known very well," she said. "You just don't use a lot of words." He brought the baby to her and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she took the baby and he watched her with him, and the lamp burned steadily on the bedside table, and outside the snow fell without wind, straight down, the quiet kind, the kind that covers the world softly and without damage. "Rodrigo," she said softly to the baby. The baby, apparently somewhat satisfied now, subsided into a cautious quiet and opened his gray-green eyes at the lamp. "Hello," Wallace said to his son. The son considered this greeting with the serious expression of a person who has not yet decided what he thinks of the world. Clara Prater came out 2 days later through the snow on her horse, which was typical of Clara Prater, and she brought a covered dish and a square of good flannel and a practical list of advice delivered without preamble, and she held the baby and said, "He looks like both of you, which is the best possible outcome," and left before dark because she knew her way home in the dark but saw no reason to prove it unnecessarily. Jim Prater came the week after with a length of good timber and a quiet smile, and helped Wallace build a fence section that had been worrying them both since November, and they worked for a full day in the cold and came in at evening to a supper that Maria had made. And Jim said grace in the plain way he always did, briefly and sincerely, and they ate together around the kitchen table with Rodrigo asleep in his crib in the next room, and the clock on the mantelpiece ticking steadily. The small brass one from Texas. In the spring of 1880, when the snow was gone and the kitchen garden was coming back and the east field was plowed and seeded again, and the north fence was new cedar posts all the way to the property line, Sheriff Garrett Hale rode out from Harrington with the news that Harlan Creed had been formally indicted on charges related to land fraud and coercion, following an investigation that had been building since the statements Wallace and Maria had provided in October of 1878. There were 6 other families in the county whose experiences had been documented, and the weight of it together was more than Creed's lawyers could manage. "I thought you should know," Hale said, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that Maria had given him. "It'll be a long court process. It may not end the way we hope, but it's on record now and he knows it." "Thank you, Sheriff," Maria said. Hale looked around the kitchen, at the clean walls and the well-kept stove and the baby in Maria's arms and the man sitting across the table who had once given him a statement that had cost him something to give. "Nice place," he said. "It is," Wallace said. After Hale left, Maria stood at the kitchen window with Rodrigo on her hip, watching the sheriff's horse disappear up the north road, and she thought about her father, about the years he had spent making this land his and defending it and loving it, and about the fact that his name was now on a deed in the county records and on the headboard of the crib in the east room, and about the way the land looked in the April light, green and wide and entirely real. Wallace came to stand beside her. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the familiar weight and warmth of him, and outside the windmill was turning in the spring breeze and the cottonwood tree was leafing out and the kitchen garden was coming up in its careful rows. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I'm going to need that room expanded," she said. "The east room." He was quiet for a moment and then he understood and she felt his arm tighten around her and she looked up at him and he was smiling, the full one, the one that did things to her. "The room is only 6 months old," he said. "The room is well built," she said. "It can be expanded." "I'll need more cedar," he said. "I know," she said. "I was thinking we might add a second window on the south side for the afternoon light." "That's good thinking," he said. "There's a Spanish word for it," she said. He looked at her. "For the afternoon light," she said, "the specific quality of it." "I know it now," he said. "Say it," she said. He said it, and this time he said it correctly, and she turned her face up to him, and he kissed her in the morning kitchen with the baby between them and the spring light coming through the window. And outside the land stretched away in every direction, wheat and promise and the long flat horizon of the Kansas plains under an enormous sky. And the windmill was turning. And somewhere along the south fence the rosemary was coming green again, and the clock on the mantelpiece kept steady and unhurried time. The way good things do when they know they are going to last. They planted 65 acres of wheat that spring, and the summer was warm and even, and in August Maria gave Wallace a daughter, a fair-haired serious child who arrived with considerably more composure than her brother had managed, and whom they called Elena, which had been Maria's mother's middle name, the woman from Virginia who had loved a man from Mexico and followed him across 2 states and given him the name the land would carry, and whose ghost was present in the house in the way that good loves are always present, in the things they leave behind. Rodrigo walked by his first birthday, which surprised Wallace and delighted him, and Elena watched her brother with a patient, analytical attention that was very much her mother and very much her own. The house had been expanded twice now, good cedar dovetailed walls, morning light in the east room, afternoon light in the south room, and it was larger than what Maria's father had built but built in the same tradition, each corner done with care, each board chosen for the work it would do. Wallace had a habit, in the long summer evenings when the children were settled and the work was done, of walking the fence lines of the property. Not to check them, though he noted anything that needed attention, but simply to walk them, to know where the land was bounded and what it contained. He had done this from the first autumn, before he and Maria were married, before anything between them was certain, and she had noticed and understood it before he had said anything about it, because she had done the same thing herself, for different reasons but the same reason, because this was the land and you walked it to know it. Sometimes she came with him. Sometimes she brought Rodrigo on her hip, and they walked the north fence line in the evening with the wheat gold on one side and the road on the other, and the big sky doing its long, slow darkening, and they talked about the fencing and the yield and the price in Caldwell Creek, and what the Praters had said about the well in the east section, and what they intended to do about the creek crossing that washed out every spring and ought to be properly bridged. And sometimes they didn't talk at all, and the evening went quiet around them, and the land was simply the land, theirs and also the land's own, requiring and giving in equal measure, and the sky above it was the particular sky of the Kansas plains, which is not like any other sky, being too large and too honest to permit anything less than full attention. On one such evening in the late summer of 1881, with both children asleep and the house warm and the September evening going purple at the edges, they stood at the east fence line and looked out at the harvested field, the cut stalks pale in the last light, the earth dark and satisfied. "My father stood here," Maria said. The first harvest he brought in, he stood right here and looked at the field. He wrote about it in his journal. He said it was the first time since leaving Texas that he felt the land was actually his. "Do you have the journal?" Wallace asked. "Yes, it's in the cedar chest." "I'd like to read it someday," he said. "If you'd let me." She looked at him. "You want to read my father's journal?" "I'd like to know him better," Wallace said. He made all of this. He deserves to be known." She was quiet for a long moment, and the evening light was doing the particular thing it did at this hour, low and golden and entirely specific to this moment, the word she had taught him, the feeling for which there was no English equivalent. "Yes," she said, "I'll give it to you." He took her hand, the way he did without ceremony, the way they had learned to do the ordinary tender things without marking them as occasions, because the ordinary tender things were the occasions, were the whole substance of a life built with intention. The stars began to come out. One by one, then in clusters, then the whole immense population of them, filling the Kansas sky from horizon to horizon. "We should go in," she said, but made no move to go. "We should," he agreed, making no move either. They stood at the east fence of the Ramsey land and let the night settle around them, and the land was quiet, and the house behind them was full of sleeping children and the smell of supper and cedar, and the clock on the mantelpiece was ticking with its steady, unhurried confidence, and there was nowhere else either of them needed to be and nothing else that needed to be done, and the dark was not frightening but simply the dark, the ordinary dark of the plains at night, which is also full of stars. "Wallace," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you put out the torch," she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment in the warm dark. "So am I," he said. "Maria, so am I." The windmill turned. The cottonwood moved in the small night breeze. Somewhere down by the creek the frogs were singing, the same creek song they had sung in the first summer and would sing in every summer after, unchanging, faithful, entirely itself. And the land held them, all of them, the living and the remembered, the planted and the growing, in its wide and patient embrace, the way good land does, the way good things do, without asking to be thanked and without ever letting go.